So I'm Andreas Papathanasis. Hopefully I'm pronouncing it right. I grew up in Greece, born and raised in Greece. When I was 25, I moved to Texas to study video games. After that, I moved to Canada, worked for BioWare for 7 years. I did a year and a half in Finland, working on mobile social games. And now I'm back in Edmonton, back with my family and looking at what I'm doing next. So I have quite a bit of experience working in AAA games at BioWare and EA, and I also got kind of a radically different experience working on smaller mobile games. All those were really good experiences that I really value going forward.
So what's... Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
That's pretty much about it. When my goal, I left my country, well, probably it was a good idea given what's going on now, but when I left it was a hard decision, but it was really because I really wanted to work in video games and there were opportunities over there. And the approach I've been taking to this is I really want to work on games that I myself am passionate about, that I would want to play them. That's the only way I know how to do a really good job at those kinds of games. So first, going to BioWare, those were, started with Baldur's Gate, starting with Neverwinter Nights, those were really games I was playing day and night. And but over the course of 7 years, I myself changed in what kind of games I like, and also the industry or the company took a different turn as well. They kind of focused more on production values, going after Hollywood-style things that I felt they don't really kind of appeal to me that much anymore. And also, my personal life changed as well. Like, I don't have as much time as I used to have in order to play those kinds of games, hour in, hour out. So I kind of felt myself drifting away from those kinds of games, and it didn't feel right kind of keeping working on them. I found myself playing lots of mobile games as well, and that's why I moved over to Supercell as well. So that's kind of a theme that I feel like has been defining where I'm looking to work and what I'm looking to do. And now as I'm going forward thinking about what am I going to do next, that's also something I'm going to think about. Like, what's something that still excites me in terms of games, something I want to play myself. And so that's very roughly like my experience in video games.
So what sort of things specifically were you doing at these different companies? Because you mentioned some pretty big titles.
Yeah, I have a technical background, so I started as a programmer, then lead graphics programmer, lead programmer. I was doing, as I gained more influence on the project, I was doing kind of more production style stuff as well, but always on the AAA team I was always on a technical role, so doing programming. In Finland the teams were smaller, and kind of, even though you do have a specialization, it's expected that all of the people are involved in many different aspects, so I also did some of the design as well, so I was exposed to that area. But my background is technical. Going forward, I want to definitely be exposed more to the other side, especially the design part of making games.
Mm-hmm. So, I don't know. I guess to start off, like, well, I think like in one of your last emails to me, you were just saying like you weren't even sure how this conversation was going to go, or what it was going to look like. I guess like tell me a little bit about that. I mean, do you feel like your focus and the sorts of things you want to talk about, like, is it there really not that much of it out there, or
like what kind of stuff do you mean?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, the handful of things you said. I mean, you had mentioned like, you're trying to distance yourself so much from AAA, and I forget specifically what you said about just like, the curiosity and passion for that space.
Yeah. So again, I grew up kind of playing those kinds of games, and I felt like I will always definitely like playing them. So what I was seeing, both in the games I was making, but also in other games, I got the Xbox 360s, the PS3s. I was buying all the latest games that were coming out every month. And they were, at some point, like, it felt like after playing the same game, I don't know, 10 times, it felt like, why am I doing this anymore? It's not fun. This is not changing at all. I was also exposed to come the other smaller games that people are trying kind of different things. Probably started with Braid, started with completely different themes being explored, games like Papers, Please, those kind of games, and it kind of made me jealous that those kind of games can try so many different things, whereas the games that the AAA guys are working, it's kind of the same thing over and over, only with different, very, very small differences every time on the gamepad.
I mean, you had written that thing about creativity dwindling in that space. Do you think, is it like, well, you said that you're abandoning the tech arms race, but I mean, do you think is it time to sort of like abandon hope that that space is going to try to get more creative?
Well, I see definitely things we need to change, because we can always say, oh, that space should definitely be more creative, but there's some really strong forces that make that really hard. When those games are so expensive, you can't just go and get creative with that money, because you might as well lose it. When being creative means you try different things, and when you try different things, some of those things won't work out, and you simply can't do that when there's hundreds of millions of dollars at stake. But at the same time, I feel like those things are things that they're being talked about a lot. So I'm not sure how interesting it is for us to kind of reiterate those things.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I guess
it would be a very interesting question how those studios can become more creative. I definitely think there's potential for them to spawn smaller teams, kind of do experiments, then scale up on the experiments that do work out. I don't know. Maybe those are kind of things that already are being talked about.
I mean, is there evidence of like people trying? Like I think from the outside it's seen as like this lockstep thing of just like, yeah, we're going to be really risk averse. But I mean, I don't really know the internal politics of it. I mean, do you get the sense that like there are developers pushing more for that, but just the money side just keeps their hands tied and they really can't? Or is everyone sort of in agreement, like, yeah, we're just going to be more conservative? Or like, what's your sense?
When you look at the AAA team that's 300, 500 people, absolutely there are people who have different opinions, and some of those people, of course, they're pushing for people to be less conservative, trying more things out. It's pretty impossible to find a team that's 300, 400 people and all of them are in agreement. Yes, this is definitely the thing we should do. Because that amount of people there, you get all kinds of opinions. But personally, I was in a situation where we tried to push some of that stuff and it didn't work. I know of other people in other companies that tried to push some of that stuff and it didn't work. We do have examples of big companies trying to do some of that stuff, and it's working out great. We have very recently the Fallout mobile game. We have Blizzard doing great stuff with Hearthstone. So it really depends on the particulars of each situation whether such efforts for innovation can go forward or not.
Well, I mean, so you left that sort of work behind, but I'm curious, like, there's that cliche job interview question, like, where do you see yourself in 5 years? Like, where were you hoping those industry jobs would take you, or what were you hoping they'd be a path towards?
Yeah. So for me personally, all the overhead and all the will it work, will it not work with innovation in the big team, that's not worth, all that overhead is not worth it to me. Like the way forward for me, I see, is to find other people who are as passionate as me about specific games, and then we can do it ourselves. This is an era where we don't feel like in order to sustain a small team, you need kind of the power, the marketing muscle, of the infrastructure of the big guys, the big publishers. In the 90s, you needed them. Now you can go directly to your fans and hopefully if you build something good, that can sustain a small team. So for me personally, while the question, how do we improve innovation in big AAA teams, might be interesting in theory, that's not personally something I'm looking to fix myself. For me, the way forward is we can do it ourselves in smaller teams.
Well, you had said too in your email, like what bothers you is there's some passionate developers working on things they don't love, thinking it's a necessary evil to work on things that the market is looking for.
Yeah.
I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about that, but also like, how is that made clear that like, this is what they should be working on? Like, where does that information come from, and how is it presented?
Well, if you're working on a big AAA team, the game is defined. It's usually going to be some kind of sequel, which kind of already narrows down extremely what kind of game it's going to be. And then there's going to be lots of outside influence from the team on what features is okay to do and what features is not okay to do. And if someone's really excited or passionate about trying something different, it just can't work. And it kind of makes sense to some degree, because you can have 200 or 300 people trying the whole thing. There will be absolute chaos.
Yeah.
The other area where I'm seeing that a lot as well with some teams is, on the mobile app stores, there's lots of they're looking at what's the successful thing right now, and they're trying to emulate that. There's maybe 10 or 15 kind of game archetypes, and they're being cloned to death. And I've been talking to other people who are literally kind of forced. The boss basically says, you need to copy this game and make me a clone, and you can do whatever minor changes you think are right. But that's pretty depressing for someone creative to kind of have to go through that process.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, maybe they don't feel like, there's the question of job security, and even though many of those people I know for a fact are not happy with it, they just feel like they can kind of have to continue there. Maybe that's how life works. Maybe you can't really do what you're excited about. And I just think that's sad. Maybe it's true. I haven't made something myself that I'm excited about, and I haven't proven that it can be viable. So maybe I'm an idiot. Maybe it can't work out. But I still think it's worth trying out.
I mean, it seems... I don't even want to make an assumption, but like from the inside, like what erodes that passion, like, of wanting to make games, like when you end up, working on sequel after sequel. You don't have to speak for you and your experience, though you can certainly blend it in, but like what was it for you personally that just like eroded your feeling of like, yeah, I'm going to stick with this and I'm going to work on the next sequel?
For me personally, it was kind of seeing the thing move away from what the part I was excited about. So, well, I don't know if we can get into this without kind of talking more specific about the games I worked on, and I'm not sure if that's a good idea.
Yeah, I understand. Is there any way you can talk about it at all, like your feelings without like specific things you were working on? I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm curious.
I'm not sure how.
Okay, I don't think so either. I mean, that's something I'm also trying to get a sense of, is like, so I guess it's like no different from any other industry, right, where a job is a job and they're hard to come by, and are there a lot of people, is that your sense of like working past that point of like, they've sort of lost the passion, but they have a family, they need insurance, like they're not. What's that?
I think there are enough. I know they exist. I can't really talk about percentage how big it is, but this is kind of that makes me sad personally.
Yeah. Well, something else you said, as far as like things you'd like to see go away a little bit is process related. And so you've talked about crunch, and I've heard different things from different people that like crunch isn't as bad anymore. But then I talk to anyone who's done it, and they say it's still going on. I don't know. I mean, I don't assume it's going away. But something you wanted to talk a little bit about was voluntary crunch, which I haven't talked about with anyone yet, but I assume that's sort of like a culture, peer pressure, everyone else is doing it type thing, or how does that work?
Yeah, from my view, it's not going away. From what I'm seeing and talking to other people, it's just as bad as when we began, even though there's been definitely more discussion over the last few years, and all of the discussion is pretty much, it's bad, don't do it, it doesn't help, but especially in AAA teams that I'm not hearing about. When you hear people talking against crunch, they're usually kind of like from small teams, or they kind of left the AAA industry, now they can talk freely against it. But what I find interesting is that you don't hear that much about those big studios, and the kind of crunch I saw, and I think it's really just as bad, is the kind of where people say, well, when you're passionate, and I also use that word, passionate, and when you're passionate, you kind of have to work more hours. It doesn't feel like extra work, but the kind of side effects it creates on the project overall, and other people who just can't or won't, or they have maybe games is part of the passion they have for life, but they also have other passions, and that's the more healthy thing. But those guys are really kind of isolated, and they're put in a very difficult situation, those kind of things, and they're eventually driven out as well from this kind of thing. I think that's also bad. It's also bad personally, like if you kind of push yourself and then you really work for months and months over time, even if you impose that on yourself, it just has the exact same side effects. And I know those things because I was that guy in my 20s. I was the guy who very foolishly kind of thought, oh, I can do this forever, and maybe even, I'm ashamed to say, but maybe even I'm better than everyone else for staying until the wee hours and everybody else leaves at 5. So I went through that process, and I found out it doesn't work in the long term. So that's what kind of makes me passionate against crunch as well. I'm not like some kind of outsider who says, well, you guys are overworking yourself, you can't work. But I went through that process.
So what is crunch? Literally, the way I hear everyone describe it is like the couple of sentences you said at first, like, it's horrible, it's terrible, but like, I mean, it's a lot of work to do and not a lot of time. But like, what does that actually look like? What does that actually mean?
You mean what happens in practice?
Yeah, I mean, I know it's horrible, but I mean, I'm still trying to visualize what it is and grasp, like, literally, like, what's happening.
Well, in practice, the game will have a set of milestones, and then it will have a date far in the future, 6 months or a year from now, that it has to be at a certain state. And then as that date approaches, and it becomes pretty obvious it won't be at that stage, then either through mandated or people feel like they have to kind of stay longer to meet that state, they end up working crazy hours. So games are a pretty complex thing to make, and it's pretty crazy to expect that you'll know the state of the thing 6 months or a year from now. But usually when the date appears, because of other forces, especially in big games, you literally can't afford to not be in that state by that time, because there's going to be rather many bad side effects. So it feels like there's no other way out, and either team leads or the team members themselves feel like they really have to kill themselves in order to accomplish that state.
And so these milestones have to be met because, like, sorry if this is a naive question, but just to demonstrate for people reading, like these milestones can't move because why? Very
often because you need them to keep getting funding. Depends on the project, but many of them, literally, like the publishers, depends on what relationship you also have with the publisher. But they might say, depending on how they feel, especially that well, there's not enough projects, so the game is killed. We won't fund it anymore. In big companies, especially public companies as well, there's huge pressures to meet the shipping date, because that's what the market expects, and kind of not to do that is kind of a really bad thing for the short term. This kind of short-term versus long-term thing is an interesting approach. Like, I totally see crunch as an attempt to kind of improve short-term results. A huge cost at how the game itself will be long-term, or how viable the company would be in the long run. Especially in public companies as well, I've seen this happen very often, like trying to get small short-term benefits at the cost of longer-term viability.
Yeah. So this is not super related, but maybe, like, I talk to a lot of people who work on a lot of big companies or a lot of big games at a lot of big companies, and obviously it's a self-selecting group. I'm not talking to the people who are the happiest or most pleased. They might be able to see the upsides to it, but I mean, these sometimes bad business practices, like do the perks help? Like, what are the perks even like at a big game company?
Well, I guess the biggest thing is if you really like the game you're making and you get the time to work on that, then you can say, I'm really happy with that. That's something I was hearing very often. It was true for me as well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like, as an employee, like, certainly, the work, you're there because, again, there's that word again, passionate, but, like, do they do things to try to make it up to you for all that crunch and for a lot of those really bad conditions?
There's pizza.
Are you serious?
Well, usually it's not paid out. Like, that's the thing that could be done. And I think if crunch was paid out, then you suddenly see discussion about other ways to prevent crunch, funnily enough. But
what do you mean paid out?
Overtime pay.
Oh, I see. Okay, yeah.
But like, many of those places are good in general to work at. Like, they have employee perks, they have things like lunch, things like free massages, or things people care about. I haven't seen anything. Like, sometimes what will be done is you get extra vacation time depending on the time you crunch. So those are some ways they try to make it right. I still don't think it's right.
I'm sorry, what?
I still don't think it's right. But those are some of the ways they try to make it right.
Yeah. I mean, but it sounds like the culture you're talking about, like, can you even take vacation when you're working on projects like this?
Usually for after the project is done.
Yeah, not during. And you're sometimes working on these for how long? Like a year, 2 years? Yeah, I mean, I'm just shaking my head. Partly because it sounds familiar to my own industry, but also just because it sounds grim to, like, kill yourself for 2 years. And then, I talked to Zeshik a while ago. I think I sent you that link, and we were talking about, like, originally, when that company started off, like, you could ship a game and then you could be done, and now there needs to be like a 24-hour cycle of stuff coming out. Like, that Batman game just came out, and then like 2-3 weeks later, there's already some DLC coming out. I mean, I guess, like, that's another thing I've never really asked about and I'm curious about, is just, like, between projects, like, what do these game companies look like? Like, what are they working on? Or are they never at a standstill?
Well, usually the team transitions off to the next project gradually. So
yeah.
You have a team, I don't know, maybe from the 100 people that worked on the previous game, maybe 50% stay on the same game, whereas a small select team goes out, figures out what the next game is, and then one project ramps down and the other one ramps up. That's the kind of simple, simplistic way. Sometimes you may have many projects going on, or different DLC kind of. So, but yeah, basically it's an exercise between projects to figure out where the team is at each point of time while it's ramping off from one project into the next.
How is time wasted making video games on this scale?
time is wasted on various forms of complexity that kind of as the team size goes up, it's really, really hard to keep certain types of complexity under control. Communication complexity is one of the most obvious ones. You have 200-300 people, they need to stay up to speed on things, so you have lots of meetings, you have lots of process, lots of discussion, explain the same thing back and forth. There's lots of misunderstandings between people. There's sometimes team A does something that's not compatible with what team B is doing, so you have to undo and redo those things. Technology gets complex as you kind of accommodate different workflows for different people working on the team. So there's different kinds of complexity, and those end up eating lots of time.